I live in Fresno, California, and recently bought a new house that I thought would be perfect for me. The place looked great when I first saw it. It had a charming feel and was in a nice neighborhood. But as time went on, strange things started happening, and it quickly became clear that my new home was haunted. One of the first things I noticed was the sound of crying at night. I would hear a soft, sad wail coming from under my bed. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the crying continued night after night, growing louder and more distressing. It felt so eerie that I started to dread going to bed. One evening, after coming home from work, I parked my car and heard that same crying noise again. This time, it was coming from under my other parked car. I checked outside and under the car, but there was no one there. It was as if the sound was coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. I felt a chill run down my spine and quickly went inside, trying to shake off the feeling of dread. Things got even stranger when I heard the sound of dishes being washed in the kitchen late at night. I went to check, expecting to find someone there, but no one was around. However, I did notice a pair of high-heeled shoes by the sink. I don't own any high heels, and neither did the previous owners as far as I knew. It was as if someone, or something, had left them there intentionally, but something that almost makes my heart stop. As I walked back to my bedroom, I saw a woman combing her hair in the restroom. I stepped back to look and see nothing. I ran to my room and locked it in fear. As days went by, I began to do some research on the house. I spoke to neighbors and even consulted the local records. To my horror, I discovered that a woman had died in the house many years ago. Her death was linked to a tragic story. She had been heartbroken because her husband had cheated on her. The pain and sorrow from that betrayal seemed to linger in the house, as if her spirit was still trapped there. I couldn't believe what I was learning. The crying I had heard and the strange occurrences all made sense now. It was the ghost of that poor woman still mourning her lost love. Her spirit seemed restless and unable to move on from the pain she had suffered. The more I learned, the more unsettled I became. I tried to make the best of it, but it was hard to ignore the constant feeling of being watched and the unexplained noises. Every night felt like a battle to get some sleep, and I began to feel more and more anxious about staying in the house. Finally, I decided to talk to my real estate agent about the situation. I explained everything that had been happening and how it was affecting me. My agent was understanding and sympathetic. We discussed the options, and it became clear that selling the house was the best course of action. After much consideration and some paperwork, we put the house back on the market. It was a tough decision, but living in a haunted house was something I couldn't handle any longer. The sadness of the ghostly presence was taking its toll on my mental and emotional well-being. I hope that whoever buys the house next will have a better experience. Maybe they won't encounter the same ghostly problems, or perhaps they'll be more accepting of the house's troubled past. Either way, I'm glad to be moving on. As for me, I'm looking for a new place to call home. It's a relief to think about leaving behind the haunting memories and starting fresh somewhere new. I just hope my next house will be a happy, peaceful place where I can feel safe and at ease. This experience has been deeply unsettling, but it has also taught me a lot about the supernatural and the stories that sometimes come with old houses. For now, I'm ready to close this chapter and find a new place to settle down. Moving forward, I'll be more cautious and do thorough research before purchasing a new home. I never imagined I'd find myself living in a haunted house, but it's a story I'll always remember. My name is Fong. When I was 19, I had a big argument with my parents. Frustrated and angry, I jumped into my car and drove off, wanting to get as far away as possible. I sped through the roads, not really caring where I was going. It was dark, and the forest around me grew thicker and more foreboding. The trees seemed to close in, and soon I realized I was lost. No matter which way I turned, I couldn't find a way out. The forest was endless with no clear path or direction. I drove around for what felt like hours, but nothing seemed familiar. Just when I was starting to lose hope, I spotted a faint light through the trees. I followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. As I got closer, I saw an old, rundown house standing alone in the middle of nowhere. It looked abandoned, but I was desperate and needed help. I parked my car and walked up to the front door. With a shaky hand, I knocked. The door creaked open and a woman appeared. She looked kind, with a welcoming smile. I asked if I could come in for some water and food, explaining that I was lost. She agreed and invited me inside. Her house was surprisingly warm and cozy, with old furniture and dim lighting. Her daughter came into the room. She was quiet and seemed a bit shy. I noticed something strange about both of them. Their eyes were completely black, like deep, empty pits. Their teeth were also black, as if they had never been cleaned. I tried to ignore it and sat down at the table where they served me some food and water. As I ate, I thanked them for their hospitality. I felt a bit uneasy, but tried to stay calm. After finishing my meal, I said goodbye and left the house. I hoped that finding my way back would be easier now. However, as I drove off, something strange happened. No matter which direction I took, I ended up back at that same old house. It was as if the forest was trapping me, making sure I couldn't escape. I tried again and again, but every road led me back to the eerie house. The fear began to set in. I could feel my heart racing and my hands shaking. I tried different routes, hoping one would lead me out, but nothing seemed to work. The house with the black-eyed woman and her daughter seemed to be following me, no matter how far I drove. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a path I hadn't noticed before. I took it with a mix of hope and desperation. This time, the forest seemed to open up, and I saw a familiar road in the distance. I couldn't believe it. I was finally getting out. As I drove away, I looked back one last time, half expecting to see the old house standing there in the dark. But it was gone. I made my way back to civilization, feeling a deep sense of relief. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I don't know who or what those people were, but I learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes, in our anger and frustration, we wander into places we don't understand, and sometimes those places are better left behind. I want to tell you about something that happened to me one night in California. It was a dark and quiet road, and I still shiver whenever I think about it. I was driving home after a long day, and the sky was black as pitch, with only the moonlight to guide me. As I drove down that lonely road, I could see the trees on either side, their shadows dancing in the moonlight. I was feeling tired but safe, thinking about nothing but getting home. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I realized it was a woman standing in the middle of the road. She looked like she was wearing traditional Hmong clothes, the kind with bright colors and intricate patterns. Her clothes fluttered as if there was a breeze, but there wasn't any wind that night. I slowed my car and honked the horn, thinking she might not have seen me. She didn't move. I rolled down my window and called out, asking if she needed help. Still, she stood there, completely still, her back to me. I began to feel uneasy. I thought maybe she was lost or in trouble, so I decided to get out of the car. As soon as I stepped onto the road, a cold chill ran through me. It felt like someone had just walked over my grave. I approached her cautiously, but she remained motionless. When I got closer, I noticed something strange. Her feet were not touching the ground. She was floating a few inches above the pavement. My heart started pounding in my chest. I called out to her again, but there was no response. Suddenly, a gust of wind picked up, even though the air was still before. It blew through me, making me shiver. I could see the woman's face now. Her eyes were dark, hollow, and staring straight ahead. Her expression was one of deep sadness and despair. I took a step back, feeling the ground shake beneath me. The road seemed to stretch longer and longer as I tried to retreat. The woman's head turned slowly, her gaze meeting mine. There was something in her eyes that I can't describe, but it filled me with fear. Without thinking, I ran back to my car, my breath coming out in sharp gasps. I jumped in, started the engine, and sped away. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her standing there, watching me as I drove off. I didn't stop until I reached a well-lit area. My hands were trembling as I held the steering wheel. I couldn't believe what I had seen. I felt like I had escaped something terrible. When I finally got home, I locked all the doors and sat in silence. I tried to tell myself it was just a dream or a trick of the light, but every time I close my eyes, I see her face. Since that night, I've heard stories from other Hmong people about a ghostly woman who wanders the roads, lost and searching for something she can never find. I don't know if it was her I saw, but I hope I never encounter her again. Every time I drive on dark roads now, I keep a lookout, just in case. I've learned that some roads hold secrets we might not want to uncover. When I was living in Laos, there was a woman in our village who was the talk of everyone's whispers. Nobody had ever seen her face, and no one knew much about her, except that she lived on the edge of the forest in a small old house. It all started one evening when the sun was setting and casting long shadows. I had heard stories about this mysterious woman, but never thought much of them until I met her myself. One day, as I was walking back home from the fields, I saw her standing by the edge of the forest. Her figure was faint against the trees, and she seemed to be looking right at me. I felt a chill, even though the air was warm. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked closer, hoping to finally see her face. But as I got near, she vanished into the forest. It was as if she had never been there at all. My heart raced, and I hurried home, telling myself it was just my imagination. The next day, I heard more stories about her. They said she was cursed and that anyone who tried to see her face would suffer terrible misfortune. I laughed it off, thinking it was just old tales to scare children. But then, strange things started happening. My chickens went missing, and my crops began to wilt. It was as if some dark force had settled over my home. I couldn't explain it, but I couldn't ignore it either. One night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that woman and the stories. I decided to go outside to clear my mind. As I stepped into the night, I saw a figure in the distance, exactly like the woman I had seen before. I tried to call out to her, but she didn't respond. Instead, she moved deeper into the forest, and I felt a cold, heavy presence surrounding me. Fear gripped me, and I ran back inside, locking all the doors and windows. The following days were no better. My house felt colder, and every time I looked out, I could see shadowy figures flitting through the trees. I knew I had to do something, so I went to see the village elder. The elder listened to my story with a grave expression. He told me that the woman was not just a person, but a spirit from an old Hmong legend. She was said to have been wronged long ago and now lived in the forest, never showing her face to anyone. According to the elder, the only way to appease her was to make an offering. I was terrified, but knew I had to try. That night I prepared a simple meal with rice and fruit and left it at the edge of the forest where I had first seen her. The next morning, the house felt lighter, and the strange happening seemed to stop. My chickens returned, and my crops started to grow again, but I still couldn't shake the fear of what I had experienced. Even though the problem ceased, I couldn't forget the chill of that night and the fear in the elder's voice. I often wonder if the woman was truly appeased, or if she was merely waiting for someone else to come too close. I still live with the memory of that woman in the cold, dark forest. I never ventured near it again, and I always took care to avoid the edge of the trees, where shadows seemed to move on their own.